other key partners, such as Georgia, Moldova, Finland and Sweden, as well as the European Union. NATO will engage in dialogue with Russia in good faith and on substance. But we must also be prepared for the possibility that diplomacy will fail. So today, ministers stressed that any further aggression against Ukraine would have significant consequences and carry a heavy price for Russia. Allies continue to stand with Ukraine. We fully support its sovereignty and territorial integrity, and we provide political and practical support. I will chair a meeting of the NATO-Ukraine Commission on Monday. We will be joined by Foreign Minister Dmytro Kuleba to discuss the evolving situation. All countries, regardless of their size or who their neighbours are, have the fundamental right to decide on their own path and their alliances. This has been a fundamental principle of European security for decades, and Russia has committed to uphold it. Finally, allies made clear that NATO will always take the necessary steps to protect and defend our nations, including by strengthening our collective defence as necessary. Today's meeting demonstrated once again NATO's unity and cohesion. We are an indispensable forum bringing Europe and North America together to consult on our security, to protect our people and to uphold our values. And with that, I'm ready to take your questions.
And we'll take questions both here in the room but also online. We'll start in the room with Agence France-Presse.
Hello, Secretary General. Thank you very much. Max Delaney, AFP. Several points on the NATO-Russia Council. You've said many times before that the open door policy is non-negotiable and that other elements that Russia proposed, and it seems that other elements that Russia proposed, such as withdrawing forces from countries that joined after 1997, have been widely dismissed by allies. So can you give a guarantee now that there will be no concessions on these points in the talks with Russia? And secondly, did you, beyond that, see any scope for negotiation in the documents that Russia published? And thirdly, what guarantees do you has the US given to allies that they won't cut a deal without including the Europeans?
It was a very strong and unified message from all allies today that we need to engage in dialogue in good faith and actually do whatever we can, make every effort to ensure a political path forward. But at the same time, all allies also sent a very clear message that we will not compromise on core principles, including the right for every nation to decide its own path, including what kind of security arrangements it wants to be part of. These are principles which are enshrined in documents which also Russia has subscribed to, starting with the Helsinki Final Act in 1975. And then, of course, it's also part of the NATO founding treaty. So there's no way NATO can compromise on the principle of the right of every nation to choose its own path. And that was very clearly stated by allies today. NATO allies support arms control. And we are ready to engage in arms control with Russia, conventional, nuclear. But that has to be reciprocal, and it has to be balanced and verifiable. And that's a different thing, that in a way imposing one-sided restrictions on NATO's ability, right to defend and protect all allies. And we cannot end up in a situation where we have kind of second-class NATO members, where NATO as an alliance is not allowed to protect them in the same way as we protect other allies. So balanced, verifiable arms control, yes. One-sided demands on NATO, no. And that's the big difference. The United States has been very clear that there will be no decisions about European security, no discussions about European security without the Europeans at the table. And that's exactly why we welcome that the United States is so closely consulting with NATO allies, also on the bilateral strategic talks they conduct with Russia. We welcome those talks because they, for instance, address arms control, but it is very important that European allies and also Canada are involved and closely consulted with as the United States engages with Russia on these issues. European allies are at the table in the NATO-Russia Council. They were at the table today. We have to remember that NATO, we are 30 allies. 2 are North American, the United States and Canada, and 28 are Europeans. So when NATO engages in dialogue with Russia, when we discuss the security of European allies, when we discuss future European security, then European allies are at the table because European allies are in NATO. And that's what makes NATO unique and an indispensable platform, because NATO brings together Europe and North America to address common security challenges. So, of course, there's no way we can discuss European security without European allies, and that's exactly why NATO is so important when we address these issues as NATO, as we did today, or in the NATO-Russia Council meeting with Russia. Let me also add one more thing, and that is that, of course, for NATO it is important to also consult closely with partners. Just today I spoke with the Finnish President and the Swedish Prime Minister, and just after the NATO-Russia Council on Wednesday, I was straight to the EU Defence Ministerial meeting in Brest, consulting with all EU allies, or all EU members, and also the regular meetings with the EU leadership.
Okay, we'll go to Wall Street Journal.
Thanks, Wanna. Secretary General, James Marsden from the Wall Street Journal. A couple of questions about the Russian forces on the borders of Ukraine. Wondered if you've seen the number or the character of these forces change at all in recent days and weeks. And secondly, interested whether the ministers today discussed any plans for reinforcing NATO's eastern flank if Russia does invade Ukraine again, or if it maintains the forces in the position they are currently in for a long time. Thank you.
The Russian military buildup has not stopped. It continues. And they are gradually building up with more forces, more capabilities. We see armored units, we see artillery, we see combat-ready troops, we see electronic warfare equipment, and we see a lot of different military capabilities which are gradually building up in and around Ukraine. The challenge is that when you see this gradual military buildup combined with the threatening rhetoric, the rhetoric that if you don't do exactly as we say and agree to our demands that they know are not acceptable, violating core principles for European security, combined with the track record of Russia that have actually used force against neighbors before, Georgia and Ukraine. The capabilities, the rhetoric and the track record, of course, that sends a message that there is a real risk for a new armed conflict in Europe. But that's exactly why it is so important to engage in dialogue and to sit down, and therefore also the reason why I welcome that Russia now is willing to meet in the NATO-Russia Council. That at least is a positive signal, and then we will engage in good faith. We will listen to Russian concerns. We will discuss different issues. I believe there's absolutely a possibility to look into, for instance, arms control, but also transparency on military activities, mechanisms to reduce risks for incidents and accidents, and of course lines of communications, military and civilian, and other issues. And it was a very strong support from ministers today that we should engage in dialogue on these issues. After 2014, when Russia invaded Ukraine the last time, or when they used military force against Ukraine illegally occupying Crimea, but also the continued destabilization of eastern Ukraine, Donbass, with support to the separatists, NATO has implemented the biggest reinforcement of collective defense in a generation, with a more military presence in the eastern part of the alliance. With the battle groups in the Baltic countries and Poland, we have tripled the size of the NATO response force, and we see air policing, we see also more presence in the Black Sea region, and we are constantly assessing whether there is a need for further adjustments or posture, our military presence in the eastern part of the alliance, and of course we also do that in light of what happens in Ukraine.
Okay, we'll go here to the National News Agency of Ukraine. Third row, thanks.
Dmitry Shkulko, National News Agency of Ukraine, concerning the Russian rhetorics. Russia, including some Russian officials, openly threaten Ukraine to destroy it during the minutes. That means that it is like a real threat of missile blow to the major cities and critical infrastructure. So my question is if ministers or NATO on some kind of level consider the possibility to assist Ukraine in developing its own anti-missile capabilities, or at least its element to defend itself. And the follow-up, if I may, are there any kind of political preconditions for NATO to establish over Ukraine no-flight zone in case of escalation, like it was done in Iraq, for instance? Thank you.
Ukraine is a sovereign, independent nation, and Ukraine has, of course, the right to defend itself. That is a right which is enshrined in the UN Charter. And when Ukraine is threatened, I think everyone understands that Ukraine is actually stepping up its efforts to be able to defend itself. And NATO allies provide support to Ukraine to enable Ukraine to uphold the right to defend itself. And that's the reason why we not only provide political support, to Ukraine's territorial integrity and sovereignty, but also provide practical support with helping to modernize the Ukrainian armed forces. NATO allies are providing training, capacity building, and also some allies are providing different types of equipment. So Ukraine is not a NATO ally, but Ukraine is a close and highly valued partner, which is threatened by Russia, and where Russia actually occupies part of Ukrainian territory and continue to destabilize eastern Ukraine, Donbass. And therefore, one of the messages in the meeting today was the need to provide support to Ukraine in different ways, and allies provide support, and also NATO as an alliance provide support to Ukraine. The whole idea that Ukraine is a threat to Russia is to put the whole thing upside down. Ukraine is not a threat to Russia. I think, if anything, it is the idea of a democratic, stable Ukraine which is a challenge for them. And therefore NATO will continue to provide support to a partner, to a sovereign nation, but also, of course, recognizing that Ukraine is a partner, not a NATO ally.
We'll go to ZDF.
Good afternoon, Florian Neuhan from ZDF German Television. Mr. Stoltenberg, I'd like to know whether the crisis in Kazakhstan has been raised today at the meeting. What is NATO's reaction to the Kazakhstan crisis? And what do you think, from your point of view, does this have any impact on Russia's plans regarding Ukraine? Thank you.
NATO allies and NATO are following the situation in Kazakhstan very closely. We are concerned, we regret the loss of lives, and of course it is important that violence ends and that human rights are respected, including the right of peaceful demonstration and freedom of expression. And many allies have expressed this, and I expressed this as Secretary General of NATO that we are following closely and concerned about the situation and the need to end violence and respect human rights in Kazakhstan.
Nimedi?
Thank you very much. Mr. Secretary General, you have just mentioned that it's very important for NATO engagement with partners, aspirant countries, especially for Georgia and Ukraine. How are you going to increase the practical and political support for these two countries? And with it to convince Russia that they have no veto and they have no right to close the door of this organization, which is open for Ukraine and Georgia, as they are asking to disavow the Bucharest summit decision. And I want to ask you also, is this topic, future enlargement and future membership of Georgia and Ukraine, on the table for the next week meeting? Thank you very much.
I think we have to understand that the enlargement of NATO has been extremely important for stability and peace and freedom and democracy in Europe. The enlargement of NATO and the European Union has really helped over the last decades to spread and to strengthen democracy, freedom in Europe. And it's not that NATO has dragged countries into our alliance. It has been decisions by independent nations through democratic processes, through their free, independent decisions, that they wanted to join NATO. And then after a process, we have accepted new members into our alliance. And by doing so, we have helped to protect democracy and freedom throughout Europe. So this is about respecting free democratic decisions by individual nations in Europe. And we demonstrate, NATO has demonstrated also over the last years, that NATO's door remains open by admitting North Macedonia and Montenegro as new members of the alliance. Then we stand by our decisions at the Bucharest summit when it comes to Ukraine and Georgia. We support and help them on their way towards further Euro-Atlantic integration with reforms, with practical and political support. And I strongly believe that partly it is important to send a message that reforms is important partly because it is a way to meet NATO standards, but it also makes the societies of Ukraine and Georgia stronger. So resilient, well-functioning societies are also less vulnerable for interference from Russia. So we will continue to provide support and continue to work with Georgia and Ukraine as we move forward.
We have TV2, Norway.
Mrs. Elin Sørsdal, good afternoon, Secretary General. How do you prepare for a failure of diplomacy? You said that you are not sure that diplomacy succeeds. Have you discussed, for instance, moving of capabilities?
NATO has a dual-track approach to Russia. We need to now engage in dialogue. We will do so in good faith, and we will sit down with Russia on Wednesday. And we also welcome the fact that the United States are engaging bilaterally with Russia. And then we will do whatever we can, make every effort to ensure a political way forward, preventing the use of force, also preventing Russia from using military force against Ukraine. But at the same time, and in parallel, we need to be prepared for that the talks break down, and that diplomacy will fail. And that's exactly why we are sending a very clear message to Russia that if they once again decide to use military force against a neighbor, then there will be severe consequences, a high price to pay, economic sanctions, financial sanctions, political sanctions. And this has been conveyed by NATO allies, by the United States, by the European Union and others. Second, we support Ukraine. And by supporting Ukraine and underpinning their military capabilities, their armed forces. We are also increasing the threshold for Russia to use force against Ukraine. And thirdly, we are constantly assessing, evaluating the need to strengthen our presence in the eastern part of the alliance. We have, over the last years, implemented a significant increase of our presence on land, at sea, in the air policing, maritime presence in the Black Sea, the Baltic Sea. We have modernized our command structure, and not least we have the battle groups in the Baltic countries and Poland, something we didn't have before 2014. The battle groups we deployed there, we have there. I visited recently one in Latvia, the Canadian-led. They are a direct result of the Russian aggression against Ukraine in 2014. So we will assess and we will do what is necessary to make sure that there is no room for misunderstanding, no room for miscalculation about our readiness and preparedness and ability to defend all allies, also, of course, in the eastern part of the alliance.
We'll try to take a couple of questions online now. We'll go to Greg Palkett from Fox News.
Thank you very much. Secretary General, if I could just ask you two questions. One, what would be the worst case scenario? Where could you see military being used on the NATO side against Russia if it makes some moves? And number two, doesn't talking to Russia now, next week, encourage their behavior? That is, if you can put 100,000 troops on the other side of the border with Ukraine, then you'll get the West to pay attention. Aren't you encouraging them misbehavior by going forward next week?
First, on this, the last question. So NATO has been calling for Russia to engage in the NATO-Russia Council since the summer of 2019. That was the last time we met. And we have invited Russia to sit down in the NATO-Russia Council to discuss Ukraine, but also other issues for a long time. And until now, Russia did not respond in a positive way to our invitation. Now they have responded, and they have said that they are ready to sit down. So we welcome that. And for us, there is no contradiction between deterrence, defense, being strong, and dialogue. Actually, I believe that as long as we are united as NATO, as long as we are strong, as we are, then we can also engage in dialogue with Russia. Because, of course, there are many issues to be discussed. Arms control, how to build the minimum level of confidence-building measures, information about military activities, exercises, all dialogue on these issues, all kind of dialogue on these issues will help to increase our security and will be good for stability and peace in Europe. So we have for many, many years pursued what we call the dual-track approach, deterrence, defense and dialogue. And then when Russia now finally is ready to meet, then we should welcome, and I welcome the fact that they will sit down next week and meet, and hopefully that will be the start of a process where we can engage with Russia on several issues with a series of meetings in the NATO-Russia Council. Then I think we have to remember that Ukraine is a very close partner. We provide support to Ukraine, but Ukraine is not covered by NATO's collective defense clause because Ukraine is not a NATO member. They are a partner. Then we have 30 NATO allies, 28 of them in Europe. They are all covered by our collective defense clause, meaning that an attack on one NATO ally will trigger a response from the whole alliance. An attack on one will be regarded as an attack on all, one for all for one. This core principle idea of NATO, that we stand together and an attack on one will be an attack on all, the purpose of that is not to provoke a conflict, but is to prevent a conflict. And we have been able to NATO, to our collective defense, to our unity, to our Article 5 commitment to defend and protect each other, we have been able to prevent, deter an attack on a NATO ally for more than 70 years. And that's the purpose also now. So to remove any possible room for miscalculation in Moscow, we are constantly adjusting adapting our military strength, our posture, to make sure that there is no misunderstanding about that. And the purpose is not to then fight the war, but the purpose is to prevent a conflict.
For the next question, we'll go to Sky News. Adam Parsons.
Mr. Stoltenberg, thank you very much indeed. Adam Parsons here from Sky News. Two questions, if I may. One is, you seem to there be talking about the impact of sanctions. Track record of sanctions having a significant impact on the Russian regime doesn't seem that proven. Are you convinced that they are a significant deterrent? And the second thing is, taking into your point about a military build-up, of course, Ukraine's not a NATO member, but many of its neighbours are. If there was a Russian invasion of Ukraine, can you tell us how many troops you would move towards the east flank, what you would feel that you needed to do to protect NATO's eastern flank, and how quickly you could do that? Thank you.
So we will do what is necessary to protect and defend all allies. And more than that, we will do what is necessary to prevent any room for misunderstanding about our capability and willingness and commitment to protect and defend all allies. Because the purpose, again, is to prevent the conflict, is to prevent that we end up in a situation that any potential adversary believes that they can attack a NATO ally without triggering the response from the whole alliance. So, for instance, when we have tripled the size of the NATO response force, 40,000, that can quickly move, and also we have the multinational battle groups in the eastern part of the alliance, they are important not only because, of course, a battalion is a fighting capable unit, and they work together with the national defense forces, but perhaps the most important thing with these NATO forces is that they send a message that we are there, that NATO allies will be involved from day one, and therefore the whole alliance will be involved, and that's sending a very strong message of deterrence. I will not go into the exact numbers of how many troops we can move where and when, but I will say that we have significant capabilities. We have troops, we have forces, we have the readiness, we have the plans to be able to defend and protect all allies, and we are constantly adapting and also actually investing more now than we have done for many years in modernizing our military capabilities to make sure that we preserve peace in Europe.
And for the last question, we'll go to Terry Schultz, also online from NPR CBS News.
Hi, thank you very much, Mr. Secretary General. Just going back to a couple of the questions you already answered. On Kazakhstan, could we press a little bit further? You said that all allies are very concerned, but are you concerned that more instability in the neighborhood could actually affect NATO's security? How do you anticipate it will affect Russia's calculations on its ability to perhaps continue to build up in Ukraine, on its potential to further aggress? And also on open door policy, we've seen some very interesting statements coming out of Finland and Sweden, and also yourself, sir, on how the door should remain open also to Finland and Sweden, a term which normally applies to our friends in Ukraine and Georgia. Thanks very much.
First on Finland and Sweden, they are very close partners. I visited together with the North Atlantic Council last fall, both Finland and Sweden, and we are working more and more closer together. We exercise together, we consult closely. Both Finland and Sweden participate in many of our ministerial meetings, and this morning I spoke with President Niinistö and Prime Minister Magdalena Andersson, and they, of course, appreciated strongly the very close consultations between NATO and Finland and Sweden. This close cooperation is good for Finland and Sweden, but it's also good for NATO, and they are also close to NATO, bordering Norway, Denmark, and also close to the Baltic countries. my message is that NATO's door remains open, and Article 10 saying that allies or countries in Europe that meet the NATO standards, they can become a NATO member. That of course also applies for Finland and Sweden. But we respect and we highlight that this is a Finnish and a Swedish decision. So we respect a country when they decide to try to join NATO, then we sit down and negotiate an accession treaty. But we also respect them when they decide not to join. So the freedom of every nation to choose their own path includes also, of course, the freedom not to join NATO. So therefore, my message is that it is for Finland and Sweden to decide if and when they feel ready to apply for membership in NATO. In the meantime, we very much welcome the very strong and important cooperation between Finland and Sweden, enhanced opportunity partners of NATO. Then I will not speculate on in what way the developments in Kazakhstan will impact calculations by or in Moscow. I think the main message on Kazakhstan is that violence must stop. We have seen the loss of lives, and human rights must be respected, and that also includes freedom of expression and peaceful demonstration.
Thank you very much. This concludes this press conference. Good evening.
Thank you.